All right, we're going to continue on with the scientific method. Remember that our 3 learning targets here, the first one deals with differentiating between independent variables, dependent variables, control group, experimental groups, and constants, or what we call those control factors, controlled variables, I should say. So this right here is the one we're going to be focusing on today. Is really looking at when you set up an experiment, you really need to know what each of these different parts of that experiment represent. So when we talk about an independent variable, that's the variable that's being tested, okay? Sometimes we say that's what's being manipulated by the experimenter. So if we were to say plant 3 plants, plant A, B, and C, and we want to test the effects of fertilizer on the growth of those plants. Our problem question might be, how does fertilizer affect the growth of plants? And then we might form a hypothesis. If we add fertilizer to plants B, 1 teaspoon of fertilizer plant B, 2 teaspoons of fertilizer plant C, but don't give anything to plant A, then C will grow the most and plant B will grow the next highest amount compared to plant A. Okay? So what you are testing in this case would be the fertilizer, because that's what you're changing between each of those 3 groups of plants. Your dependent variable is the change that occurs as a result of, didn't get all of it there, the independent variable, okay? So whatever you're changing up here with the independent variable, what you're going to be looking for then with the dependent variable is how does that affect it? You know, what kind of result will you have? And really, what we're looking for is what is measured in the experiment. So whatever it is you're going to be looking for and measuring to see if there's a change that occurred, that's what your dependent variable is. So in this case, if we give each of these plants a different amount of fertilizer, A none, B 1 teaspoon, and plant C 2 teaspoons, we're going to measure the height of those plants, how high they've grown, and that's going to be my dependent variable because it depends on whether or not it got that independent variable. That's why we call it the dependent variable. Now, controlled variables, those are factors that are kept the same, or what we call constant. So sometimes they're called constants in an experiment. It's anything you're going to try to keep the same. Well, if we're going to try to grow those plants and the only thing we want to test is the fertilizer, then we need to make sure that everything else about this plant is the same. It needs to have the same sunlight. It needs to have the same type of soil. We better be using the same type of seed, the same type of plant. Keep it in the same conditions. We better water it the same amount. Okay? The only one thing, whenever you're doing a controlled experiment, you only want to have one independent variable. You only want to change one thing, and that's what you're going to be testing. Okay? Continuing on, when we look at the different groups that we're going to be setting up in our experiment, we break them down into 2 categories. They're either going to be the control group or they're going to be the experimental group. The control group does not receive the variable being tested. Okay, so in this case, it would be the bean plants not given fertilizer because we do not want to have that in there. Why is that? Because this is being used for comparison. We want to compare, if we did nothing to that plant, how would it grow? Then, if we added fertilizer to the other plants, how would they grow? So you need something to compare with, otherwise you really wouldn't know if it really was a big difference or not. So sometimes we call this the normal condition, whatever the normal condition is for that plant. And then if you're changing it somehow, then the group that you're changing is what we call the experimental group. Okay? The experimental group has everything the same as the control group, except it receives the variable being tested. So sometimes we call it the test group, but we want you to learn experimental group versus control group. Now, sometimes an experiment might only have one experimental group. Sometimes an experiment might have several experimental groups. So if we look up here, first of all, these are the plants given fertilizer, okay? So if we look up here, plant A would be the control group because it's not given any fertilizer. And plants B and C are our experimental groups. So sometimes you can just have maybe one, if only you wanted to test one, plant given 1 teaspoon of fertilizer versus none, you can do that. But in this case, it's they have 2 experimental groups. Okay, so you always have to identify those 5 main parts every time you're going to set up an experiment. So you really need to think about what is it that I'm going to be measuring in my experiment. Okay, what's that dependent variable? What is it I'm testing? I mean, you better know that. And that's probably based on your, problem question that you're doing. So you always have to know, what is your independent variable? What is your dependent variable? What is it you're going to measure in the experiment? What are you going to keep the same between those groups? Because one of them is going to be your control group, and then one or more are going to be your experimental groups. So you need to know, what are you going to keep the same between all of them? So those are the 5 things you really need to know. So we're going to do a little practice here. A study was conducted to test the effects of playing video games on the heart rate of 10th graders. Does this example sound familiar? 20 males and females of the same age were randomly selected to play Call of Duty. Do you call it COD or COD? I don't know. I have never played this before. I think my sons have, and they are in their 20s and 30s now. So, but they're going to play that for 30 minutes, and then another group of 20 males and females of the same age were selected to stare at a blank screen for 30 minutes. That sounds like fun, huh? After 30 minutes, the heart rates of both groups were recorded. Okay, so we're going to have to find these 5 parts again, just like what we went through in our notes. So what I like to do, and what you should get used to doing, is either highlighting or underlining as you're reading through a little experiment scenario to see if you can figure out what parts go with where. So it says a study was conducted to test the effects of playing video games. This is what they're testing on the heart rate of 10th graders. Okay? They have 20 males and females of the same age randomly selected to play Call of Duty for 30 minutes. Okay, and 20 males and females of the same age that were staring at a blank screen. So here are your 2 groups. You have these 20 males and females that play Call of Duty for 30 minutes. And then you have 20 males and females that stare at a blank screen for 30 minutes. Okay? So let's again review our different parts of our experiment here. The independent variable is what you are changing or testing in the experiment. So what's the difference between those 2 groups? It's right in your first sentence here. It's playing COD, or the video game. Because one group is going to play that, the other group is not. So that's what we are changing in our experiment. The dependent variable, what is it we're going to measure? Well, they're testing the effects of playing video games on the heart rate of the 10th graders. So heart rate, is that something we can measure? It sure is. So again, your dependent variable is what you are measuring. So it is the heart rate of 10th graders. Okay. The control group, do you suppose that's the group that's going to play Call of Duty, or the group that gets to just sit there and stare at a blank screen? Basically, they're not doing anything, right? Well, remember, the control group does not receive the independent variable, which is playing Call of Duty. So this would be group that stares at the screen, at blank screen. And this would be the group that plays, because experimental group is the one being experimented on, so they receive that independent variable, group that plays Call of Duty. Okay? What things did they keep the same? If you look back up there, what did they keep the same? Well, they had 20 males and females in each group. Same age. Okay? So those are the things they try to keep as the same as possible between the two groups. The only thing they made different was that they allowed one to play Call of Duty for 30 minutes and the other one that stared at the blank screen for 30 minutes. Okay? So usually within that first sentence, if you see a study was conducted to test the effects of blank on blank, they have just given you your independent variable and they have just given you your dependent variable. Then you go through and see what are the two groups. What is one group getting to do and the other group isn't? Okay? What did one group get that the other one did not get? And then you look at things that are the same. If you see that word same right here, that's going to tip you off that that's the things that they're trying to control. Okay? So all of those things you need to know before you do any experiment in class. You better be able to identify all of these things before you go into the lab room and do your experiment, okay? So we'll be doing more review on this and more assignments coming up.